What would have happened if the Nazi machinery of extermination had fulfilled its objective to the letter? Millions of Jewish people eliminated, families disappeared, entire communities erased from history, and Europe transformed into an unrecognizable place. This is not a work of fiction. It is a journey through a terrifying hypothetical scenario where the ideology of hatred reaches its most extreme expression, and its effects are felt in every corner of society. In this video, we will explore a world without European Jewish people. We will see how the social structure would have collapsed, how the economy and science would have been altered, how culture would have lost irreplaceable voices, and how the balances of global power would have been radically rewritten. Each chapter reveals a different layer of this tragedy, from the everyday life of cities to international politics, passing through the ethical lessons that history demands from us. Prepare yourself for an intense journey, where we will discover not only what was lost, but also how those losses would have shaped a world that could have been unrecognizable. An analysis that combines history, reflection, and warning, reminding us how fragile humanity is in the face of hatred when it becomes organized and turned into policy. Demographic consequences. Let us imagine the immediate impact of a total extermination of the European Jewish population, millions of people gone within a few years. Post-war Europe would not only have suffered the aftermath of military conflict, but also an unprecedented human void. Countries such as Poland, Germany, Hungary, Lithuania, and Romania, which had sheltered Jewish communities for centuries, would have witnessed cities, neighborhoods, and entire towns becoming depopulated or abruptly transformed. This void is not limited to statistics. It means the disappearance of family networks, religious communities, cultural associations, and social structures that had endured for generations. The disappearance of these populations would have altered the demographic structure in multiple ways. In cities such as Warsaw, Budapest, or Krakow, Jewish neighborhoods formed active centers of trade, art, and social life. Their elimination would have created empty and abandoned urban spaces, affecting population density and generating an imbalance among different ethnic and religious groups. This would have impacted not only urban life but also rural life, where Jewish people actively participated in local trade, agriculture, and craftsmanship. In the long term, the absence of the Jewish population would also have modified migration dynamics. Before the Second World War, millions of Jewish people had already emigrated to the United States, Palestine, and other regions. The hypothetical total elimination would have stopped this diaspora, leaving significant demographic gaps both in Europe and in migration destinations. This would have carried indirect social and economic consequences: broken families, the loss of transnational trade networks, and the weakening of support communities that facilitated the integration of immigrants. Furthermore, the impact would have affected the generational structure. The European Jewish community included people of all ages, from newborns to elders. Their disappearance would have drastically reduced the age diversity of certain regions, erasing entire generations and breaking historical and cultural continuity. The loss of children and young people, who are the demographic engine of any society, would have generated a cascading effect in terms of birth, reproduction, and population renewal, creating an imbalance that could have been felt for decades. There would also have been an indirect effect on other minorities and local populations. The voids left by the Jewish community could have generated internal migratory pressure, with other groups moving to occupy those abandoned spaces. However, such substitution would never have compensated for the social and cultural richness that was lost. The disappearance of the Jewish population would have represented not only a quantitative loss, but also a qualitative one. Europe's social fabric would have been impoverished, with profound consequences for cultural, religious, and community life. Finally, this hypothetical scenario allows us to understand that the Holocaust was not only a tragedy for the Jewish community, but for all of Europe. Their disappearance would have radically altered the continent's demography, leaving cities depopulated, families destroyed, communities extinguished, and an irreplaceable cultural and social legacy. The human dimension of this loss is incalculable. Each number represents lives, stories, and contributions that would have disappeared forever. Economic consequences. The complete disappearance of the Jewish population would have had an immediate and profound effect on the European economy. For centuries, Jewish people had occupied central roles in trade, banking, industry, agriculture, and craftsmanship. Their elimination would not only have meant the loss of workers and entrepreneurs, but also the disappearance of entire economic networks that connected local, national, and international markets. Cities such as Warsaw, Berlin, Budapest, and Amsterdam would have experienced a collapse in commercial activity, with numerous businesses closed and markets paralyzed. In the financial sector, the absence of Jewish bankers, accountants, and merchants would have disrupted the circulation of capital. Many of them were key intermediaries in local credit and industrial investment. Without their participation, a vacuum of trust and a paralysis of certain financial operations would have emerged, hindering the flow of loans, investments, and commercial transactions. States would have attempted to replace these functions, but the specialization and experience accumulated over generations could not easily have been restored, causing a decline in efficiency within the economic system. The impact would also have been felt in innovation and intellectual production applied to the economy. Jewish scientists, inventors, engineers, and academics had contributed to advances in chemistry, medicine, physics, and industrial technology. Their disappearance would have delayed discoveries, productive innovations, and technological developments that drove strategic sectors, affecting not only Germany, but all of Europe and, indirectly, the rest of the world. The loss of specialized talent would have reduced industrial competitiveness and the continent's capacity for economic adaptation. Another effect would have been the redistribution of goods and properties. Businesses, factories, and shops taken over after the elimination of their Jewish owners could have been assigned to the Nazi state or handed to other citizens. However, such redistribution did not guarantee efficiency. The absence of knowledge, commercial networks, and human capital would have led many businesses to fail or operate below their potential, reducing productivity and generating widespread economic losses. In rural areas, the elimination of Jewish merchants and farmers would also have had a notable impact. In many localities, Jewish people played essential roles in the production and distribution chain of food, from agricultural production to transport and sales in local markets. Their disappearance would have generated disorganization in supply and demand, temporary shortages, and price instability, directly affecting the everyday lives of the general population. Finally, the economic consequences would not have been limited to Europe. The European Jewish community was interconnected with international markets, including the United States, Palestine, and Latin America. The disappearance of that network would have disrupted international trade and the flow of capital, reducing the circulation of goods, investment, and technological cooperation among continents. In summary, the disappearance of the Jewish population would have provoked a partial economic collapse and a forced reorganization of productive, financial, and commercial sectors. It was not only the loss of individuals, but the destruction of complex structures that had sustained economic development for centuries. Europe would have emerged poorer, less dynamic, and with a reduced capacity to rebuild quickly after the war. Cultural and scientific impact. The Jewish community was not only present in the economy and urban life, but it also represented a fundamental driving force in the artistic, literary, musical, philosophical, and scientific production of Europe. Its disappearance would have meant the loss of centuries-old cultural traditions, of languages such as Yiddish and Ladino, and of unique artistic expressions that had contributed to the continent's diversity. In literature, Jewish authors had explored everything from modern narrative to philosophy and poetry, leaving behind an intellectual legacy that enriched European cultural life. Their elimination would have cut short currents of thought and innovative literary styles, depriving Europe of voices that questioned social norms, explored identity, and documented the historical experience of minorities. Many works would have disappeared physically or remained unpublished, erasing memories and accounts essential to understanding European life at the beginning of the 20th century. In music and art, the Jewish contribution was equally significant. Composers, performers, and painters had influenced movements such as Expressionism, Modernism, and European jazz. Their disappearance would have diminished innovation in techniques, styles, and artistic forms of expression. Moreover, many cultural centers and academies in cities, such as Vienna, Berlin, or Prague, would have lost indispensable talent for teaching, producing, and disseminating new works. European culture would have been impoverished, with a homogenization imposed by Nazi ideology that eliminated creative diversity and interaction among communities. In science, the absence of Jewish academics would have had a tangible impact across multiple disciplines. Physicists, chemists, mathematicians, and doctors who contributed to crucial advances, many of whom emigrated during the decade of the 1930s, would have been eliminated or silenced. This would have delayed discoveries in areas such as quantum theory, genetics, experimental medicine, and nuclear physics. European scientific research would have lost continuity, and the continent's ability to compete internationally in technological innovation would have been reduced. Education would also have suffered direct consequences. Universities and schools where Jewish people were professors, researchers, or outstanding students would have seen their functioning interrupted. The knowledge accumulated over generations would have disappeared, affecting not only academic fields, but also the training of new generations. The transmission of knowledge, especially in disciplines that relied on collaboration and mentorship networks, would have been irreversibly fractured. Beyond science and art, intellectual life in general would have been impoverished. Philosophical discussions, political debates, and critical production would have lost fundamental voices. Reflection on society, politics, and ethics would have been partial and biased, as those who offered alternative, questioning, or innovative perspectives were eliminated. This would have strengthened the ideological uniformity sought by the Nazis, limiting the plurality of thought that characterizes European culture. Finally, the loss of the Jewish diaspora would also have affected the spread of culture outside Europe. Communities that had emigrated to the United States, Latin America, and Palestine contributed to the global exchange of ideas and art. Their elimination would have reduced the circulation of knowledge, international collaboration, and European influence on global cultural and scientific development. In summary, a world without European Jewish people would have been a culturally impoverished world, with deep interruptions in science, education, music, art, and literature. The intellectual and creative diversity that had defined Europe for centuries would have been drastically reduced, leaving behind a truncated legacy and a society that was less innovative and more homogeneous. Geopolitics and balance of power. In Europe, the consolidation of Nazi power would have been much firmer and longer lasting. Without the resistance of organized Jewish communities or the international pressure caused by their persecution, the Reich might have controlled strategic territories for a longer period, imposing administrations aligned with its ideology without fear of internal sabotage or of international protest sustained by persecuted minorities. This would have allowed Germany to consolidate policies of Germanization and territorial reorganization without the limitations it actually faced after Allied intervention and the resistance of local populations. The impact on the Soviet Union and the United States would also have been significant. The emigration of Jewish scientists, engineers, and professionals to these countries before and during the war was decisive in key developments, such as the Manhattan Project and technological advances in the military field. Their disappearance would have limited the availability of highly specialized talent, affecting the speed and effectiveness of strategic projects and possibly delaying the arrival of new weapons, technological developments, and crucial scientific advances that influenced the outcome of the war. Likewise, European diplomacy would have faced a different scenario. International pressure for human rights and the defense of Jewish communities generated a certain level of vigilance and criticism toward the Nazi regime. Without the existence of these groups, many governments would have had less incentive to intervene, negotiate, or sanction Germany, which would have allowed the Reich to act with greater impunity in expansionist and repressive policies both within and beyond its borders. The global balance would also have been affected by the redistribution of human capital and resources. The loss of the Jewish diaspora meant not only the elimination of merchants and financiers, but also the disappearance of intermediaries between international markets. This would have hindered economic and diplomatic relations between continents, limiting the flow of investment, trade, and scientific and technological cooperation between Europe and America, and reducing the capacity of the Allied countries to mobilize strategic resources. Another effect to consider is the internal strengthening of the Nazi regime. The disappearance of a group identified as the absolute enemy would have created a false sense of cohesion and security among the so-called Aryan population, reinforcing the ideology of racial purity and legitimizing the political hegemony of the Führer. This consolidation would have limited the possibility of internal uprisings and prolonged the regime's existence, even after the war, leaving the continent more politically homogeneous, but less dynamic socially and culturally. Finally, the elimination of Jewish communities would have affected post-war reconstruction. Without networks of commerce, education, and culture to resume activity, many European countries would have faced a slower and more unequal recovery process. The loss of human capital, talent, and innovation would have reduced the economic and social resilience of entire nations, altering the international order in the following decades and influencing the configuration of political blocs and alliances during the Cold War. In summary, a world without European Jewish people would have radically transformed the geopolitical and strategic balance, temporarily favoring the Reich, but weakening global dynamics, innovation, and the capacity for international cooperation. The consequences would have been felt not only in Europe, but across the world, creating a political and economic map very different from the one we know. Ethical and social reflection. The hypothetical total elimination of European Jewish people raises ethical and social questions of enormous gravity. The magnitude of such a loss cannot be understood only in terms of numbers or material consequences. It represents millions of lives destroyed, stories, traditions, and human relationships that would have disappeared forever. This scenario forces us to reflect on the nature of systematic hatred and its implications for society. From an ethical perspective, a complete genocide constitutes an absolute rupture with the principles of human dignity and fundamental rights. The elimination of an entire group for racial reasons does not only extinguish lives, but also destroys communities, accumulated knowledge, and cultural diversity, turning ideological hatred into a tool of social reorganization. This shows how totalitarian projects are not limited to political domination, but seek to reshape humanity according to arbitrary criteria, denying the individuality and freedom of millions of people. In social terms, the disappearance of European Jewish people would have had profound effects on social cohesion. The diversity of cultures, traditions, and religions is a factor of social resilience. Its elimination would have created a forced homogeneity, but also a void of empathy and collective memory. Societies would have lost the ability to question their own prejudices and to learn from interaction with other groups, reducing the possibility of dialogue, cooperation, and pluralism. Another aspect to consider is progressive dehumanization. The propaganda and ideology that justified this extermination demonstrate how a population can come to accept or even participate in acts of extreme violence when prejudices and stereotypes are internalized. This process reveals that systematic hatred not only destroys its direct victims, but also morally and ethically degrades the entire community that perpetuates it, altering social norms and collective values. Ethical reflection also invites us to think about historical memory and its role in society. Understanding the magnitude of what could have occurred reinforces the importance of critical education and of recognizing diversity as an essential value. Exercises of what if are not merely speculative. They are tools to warn about the risks of intolerance, institutionalized racism, and misinformation, reminding us that the defense of human rights is a constant responsibility. Finally, from a social perspective, the disappearance of Jewish people would have eliminated not only individuals, but also networks of solidarity, community support, and civic participation. Societies would have lost models of coexistence, cooperation, and resistance that make it possible to face crises and conflicts. This underlines that the Holocaust was not only a tragedy for Jewish people, but for all of Europe and for humanity. The social fabric, collective memory, and the capacity to build just and open societies would have been deeply damaged. In summary, ethical and social reflection reminds us that behind numbers and hypotheses are human lives, cultural values, and fundamental social structures. This chapter of the analysis seeks to emphasize that the loss of an entire people is not an abstract fact, but a tragedy that transcends generations, affecting morality, culture, and the very ability of society to sustain principles of justice, pluralism, and respect for life. Historical lessons from anti-Semitism and intolerance. The history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust not only reveals the magnitude of the tragedy that occurred in Europe during the Second World War, but also provides essential tools for understanding how systematic hatred arises and consolidates. Understanding these dynamics is crucial for recognizing the early signs of radicalization, discrimination, and organized violence in any society. One of the most relevant lessons is the gradual progression of intolerance. Anti-Semitism did not suddenly emerge in the decade of the 1930s. It was built over centuries through stereotypes, legal exclusions, social discrimination, and sporadic persecutions. Nazi propaganda accelerated and systematized this process, but the ground was already prepared. This pattern repeats itself in different contexts. The normalization of prejudice and the creation of scapegoats are preliminary steps that make it easier to accept extreme policies, ranging from social exclusion to mass violence. Another key aspect is the role of education and cultural transmission in the spread of ideologies of hatred. Biased instruction in schools, censorship of opposing ideas, and the glorification of extreme nationalist narratives all contributed to the formation of generations that internalized prejudices as absolute truths. This demonstrates that critical and plural education is an indispensable preventive mechanism. Teaching history, fostering independent thinking, and promoting empathy reduce the likelihood that entire societies will adopt exclusionary ideologies. Historical memory also plays a central role. Knowing the facts, the victims, and the mechanisms of oppression provides an ethical framework for evaluating the present. Ignoring the past makes it easier to repeat mistakes, while reflecting on extreme experiences highlights the importance of democratic institutions, laws that protect human rights, and social controls that prevent the concentration of absolute power. In addition, the history of anti-Semitism shows how prejudices can be exploited by political leaders to consolidate power. The manipulation of collective emotions, fear, resentment, national pride, can generate obedience and complicity among the population, even when these emotions lead to the justification of violence. This pattern is not exclusive to Nazi Germany. It can be observed in different forms of populism, extreme nationalism, and contemporary hate campaigns. Recognizing these dynamics makes it possible to detect risks and strengthen preventive mechanisms in modern societies. Finally, the ethical reflection that emerges from the history of the Holocaust reminds us that tolerance is not only an abstract value, but an active principle that must be practiced daily. It means questioning stereotypes, denouncing discrimination, promoting respect for diversity, and defending the rights of minority groups. These actions, although they may seem small, are essential for preventing the repetition of scenarios of mass violence and genocide. In summary, studying the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust provides a practical and ethical guide. It teaches us how hatred can take root and escalate into tragedy, shows us the importance of education and memory, and warns us about the dangers of ideological manipulation. These lessons are applicable not only to the past, but also to the prevention of conflict and discrimination in the present and in the future. Connections with the Israel-Palestine conflict. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is complex and multifaceted, and understanding it requires considering decades of history, migrations, international politics, and territorial tensions. To connect this contemporary scenario with the lessons of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, it is important to analyze how history has influenced the current configuration of the conflict and the perceptions on both sides. After the Second World War and the Holocaust, millions of Jewish survivors sought refuge and a place to rebuild their lives. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 became a turning point. For many Jewish people, it represented a safe and sovereign homeland, but it also generated forced displacement and tensions with the Palestinian population that had inhabited the region for generations. This process of migration and settlement had profound consequences, generating disputes over land, resources, and political recognition that remain unresolved to this day. The memory of the Holocaust also influences Israeli politics and society. The historical awareness of the systematic extermination of Jewish people contributes to a perception of national security as a supreme value, which at times translates into very strict defense policies. This perspective, rooted in the fear of repeating past tragedies, has shaped military decisions, border policies, and diplomatic relations, creating a delicate balance between survival and prolonged conflict. On the Palestinian side, the creation of Israel and the subsequent Nakba, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948, left deep wounds and a sense of historical injustice that has been passed from generation to generation. Territorial tensions and the lack of recognition of fundamental rights fuel cycles of violence, resistance, and radicalization. These dynamics show how history and memory, when intertwined with politics and identity, can perpetuate conflicts for decades. In addition, propaganda and political discourse play a role similar to that which existed in Nazi Europe, though in a very different context. The construction of enemies, the exaggeration of threats, and the dehumanization of the other side contribute to radicalizing populations and make peaceful resolution more difficult. This demonstrates that mechanisms of ideological and emotional manipulation remain effective, and that education, dialogue, and the dissemination of truthful information are key tools for reducing tensions. Finally, studying the history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust makes it possible to understand the importance of protecting human rights and respecting diversity. The Israel-Palestine conflict, though deeply political and territorial, also belongs to the realm of human coexistence and social justice. Reflecting on the past helps contextualize the suffering and demands of both sides, emphasizing that resolution requires empathy, negotiation, and a commitment to the dignity and fundamental rights of all people involved. In conclusion, although the Holocaust and the Israel-Palestine conflict are distinct phenomena, both show how history, memory, and the perception of the other influence political and social decisions. Knowing the past and its lessons is essential to addressing current conflicts with a more humane, just, and preventive perspective, preventing hatred, mistrust, and exclusion from perpetuating over time. Final conclusion. Analyzing what might have happened if the Nazis had succeeded in completely exterminating the Jewish people of Europe allows us to understand the magnitude of the Holocaust beyond the immediate tragedy. It was not only the loss of millions of lives, but also the destruction of cultures, knowledge, communities, and social structures that had shaped Europe for centuries. Each chapter of this analysis showed how the disappearance of an entire people would have altered the demography, the economy, science, culture, and geopolitics of the continent, generating consequences that would have reverberated for decades. History demonstrates that systematic hatred and propaganda are not isolated phenomena. They are processes that develop gradually, fueled by social prejudice, political discourse, and the manipulation of collective emotions. Dehumanization, exclusion, and organized violence not only destroy those who are targeted as enemies, but also corrupt the social and moral foundations of the entire community. Learning from these mechanisms allows us to identify and prevent radicalization, extremism, and discrimination in contemporary contexts. When we bring these lessons into the present, we see parallels in current conflicts, although of a different nature. The Israel-Palestine conflict, for example, shows how history, memory, and identity influence politics and society, creating tensions that persist for generations. Narratives of the past, the fear of disappearance, and historical wounds feed decisions, discourses, and policies that can radicalize populations and perpetuate violence. Reflecting on the Holocaust helps us understand the importance of justice, empathy, and respect for human rights in the resolution of current conflicts, underlining that the protection of human dignity must be a guiding principle in all circumstances. Furthermore, historical analysis reveals that cultural diversity, critical education, and collective memory are essential barriers against the repetition of tragedies. Societies that forget or minimize past crimes run the risk of normalizing discrimination and violence. Recognizing the mechanisms of hatred, whether in Nazi Europe or in any contemporary context, allows us to act preventively, promoting coexistence and tolerance as fundamental values. Ultimately, this exercise reminds us that history is not only a record of what happened, but also a guide to facing the challenges of the present. The Holocaust and its consequences teach us that systematic hatred can transform entire societies, and that the absence of ethical vigilance, education, and solidarity can prolong conflict, suffering, and exclusion. Applying these lessons to the world today means questioning prejudice, denouncing injustice, promoting dialogue, and defending the dignity of all people, regardless of their origin, religion, or identity. Reflection on the past and its link to the present leaves us with a clear message. Memory, education, and ethical action are indispensable tools for building more just, peaceful, and resilient societies, capable of resisting hatred and ensuring that the tragedies of the past are never repeated. If you found this analysis interesting and want to keep exploring the history of the Second World War, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Here you will find more videos about Hitler, the Holocaust, decisive battles, and the events that shaped one of the most important and complex periods in history. Do not miss the next content and join us as we continue discovering the history that changed the world.